Hello, comrades. Welcome to all of you joining. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Welcome to 100 Years in the Struggle for Socialism, put on by the Communist Party of Canada and the Spark magazine. I'd like to turn it over to Kimball Carrew out on the West Coast to do a land acknowledgement for us to open this meeting.
Thank you, Drew, and welcome to everybody's who's participating in this symposium today, presenting and watching wherever we are here on the northern half of Turtle Island. We are all doing our political work, our family life, our work life on the stolen territories of Indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants of this part of the world, who were the victims of the colonization of North America. Whether we're from the East Coast, the West Coast, everywhere in between, we stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples who are struggling for the rights to their land, for their hunting and fishing rights, for the right to live on a planet that's free from the industrial corporate destruction that's being visited upon all of us. The struggle for the liberation of the working class is also a struggle for the liberation and self-determination of all nations within the Canadian capitalist state. So in that spirit, we are holding our symposium here today.
Thanks, Comrade Kimball. Sorry for the delay. So I'd like to send it to Danny Goldstick, who's the editor of the Spark magazine and member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Canada. And he is here to open it up and talk about why we're all here today. Take it away, Danny.
Our guests are about to leave, or at least they're going to start to begin getting round to be ready to commence to prepare to depart. And capitalism too has outlived its welcome. Has it ever? And that was definitely in the minds of our comrades, a couple of dozen of them, who gathered in the barn near Guelph, Ontario 100 years ago. But we've got to remember that it took quite a few centuries to get rid of feudalism from the planet. The French Revolution was a big event in that story, and people got excited all over Europe. This moment had come to get rid of feudal chains and trammels. And then a quarter of a century later, King Louis, who had been beheaded while his brother was put back on the throne, and there was a lot of disappointment. But when the dust settled, a page had been turned. Anyway, I'm not going to go through the history of the intervening time, but point out that the people who gathered in the barn had been mostly socialists even before that and before the Great War. But it was a dream. It was a vision. They realized that capitalism was standing in the way of humanity. And they really realized it with the great devastation of World War I. But then here was the Russian Revolution. It was something practical. You could actually do something about it. And they were actually very excited about that, as were lots of people. And they thought, this is the moment. Well, it was the moment, but it wasn't quite the way they thought, not quite Canadian socialism on the horizon. Well, Lenin's left-wing communism had been translated into English and published in the magazine of the BC Federation of Labor. So they were impressed by that. And the ruling powers in this country weren't willing to let things lie. No. The Russian Revolution was followed, as you know, by a terrible civil war, and 16 invading countries, including Canada, were trying to crush it. My mother who joined the Communist Party of Canada in the 1920s, told me there was a member who had been in the forces invading Russia at that time. But he fraternized with the Russian workers and he came back a convinced communist. The battle was here, though, and the new party had to get involved in the struggles of the Canadian people, and especially the working class. They had a slogan in the 1920s, according to Tim Buck: no struggle too small, no struggle too big. And historians have written about the impact that communists had on the struggles of Canadians in that time, especially on the labor movement, and especially starting in the 1930s. By the way, in the 1930s too, a lot of people thought this is the moment to get rid of capitalism. In fact, some of the capitalists got afraid of that too, and the government. If there were issues that the communists were involved in, and they were involved in all kinds of issues, as we're going to hear, but two of them, in my opinion, stand out. Of course, the labor movement and the anti-imperialist peace movement. I have a photo of my dad standing in front of a sign which says, "If you have a wishbone, wish for peace. If you have a backbone, fight for peace." I suppose that's a bit too homespun a slogan for us to use today, but it gives you a taste of what they were doing. Capitalism created a working class, organized and disciplined it, and made it therefore capable of actually taking over once it should see the need. But it also produces recurrent crises in this country or that country, and in Canada too, wars, depressions, and so on, that do shake people out of their complacency. But even that's not enough. You need, said Lenin, a subjective factor, and that's where we come in. Not only us, but especially us. The end of capitalism is inevitable, it's been said. It's not inevitable no matter what we do. It's inevitable because of what we and others are going to do. That's my contribution.
Thank you very much, Danny. So those are inspiring words to kick it off here. I just want to maybe say a couple logistical things before, whoops. I'm not being shown here. Let's see. There we go. Now hopefully you can see me. Just a couple of things to let everybody know what we have planned this afternoon. We have 5 other speakers to talk a little bit about particular areas of history, struggles that the Communist Party has been involved in. This is, of course, to celebrate the centenary, continue to celebrate the centenary of the Communist Party of Canada. And it lines up with the issue, two new issues, a double issue of the Spark magazine, which is the Marxist Theory and Discussion bulletin for the Communist Party of Canada. And the plan is we do want to try and do this as interactively as possible, although that's difficult with a live stream event such as this. So if you have comments and questions, please put them in the chat function if you can on YouTube. And we will be able to, after the presentations, we hope that we have about 45 minutes to do some more discussions with the panelists based on your comments and questions you put in the chat. So feel free to do that anytime, and I will be trying to capture that and summarize it when we have a break at the end of the scheduled program for discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first author of one of the articles in the latest Spark magazine. That's Jean Maguire. She is a leading force on the Women's Commission centrally and in Ontario. and she's the organizer of the Davenport Club here in Toronto, longtime member of the Communist Party of Canada. So I'd like to turn it over to her, and she's going to talk about the Communist Party in defense of women. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you very much, Drew, and thank you for having me as part of this very significant event in marking 100 years of the Communist Party of Canada. So comrades and friends, sisters and brothers, I wrote an article and I attempted to trace many of the events and many of the people who were part of the origins of the Communist Party and its early struggles, and particularly with reference to the women who were part of that struggle and to the organizations which they created and which they led. Today, rather than trying to reprise that article, what I thought I would like to discuss with you is on what basis is it legitimate to, what is the basis of legitimacy for an organization to claim that it is the leading force with respect to the rights of women? And I think that I'd like to suggest there are 5 criteria for judging an organization's ability to stake that claim, to make that claim. And the first criteria is the criteria of what is their analysis of the origin of the problem. Now, what's significant about that, of course, is that in order for you to create an analysis, the organization has to presume that there is a problem. And in that respect, of course, that was the case, that there was an understanding that there was a problem called the inequality of women, and there was an analysis. Now, all policies that any organization makes about anything, actually, but when we talk about women or politics, all policies are based on some form of an analysis, whether it's explicit or implicit. I mean, if you make a law that says strikes are illegal, that's based on a certain analysis about the potential problems of a working class that's aroused and militant. So you make a policy to fight that. That's the analysis behind it. So the first question about analysis is, what is the analysis? Now, for Marxists, the answer is easy because it's openly articulated. And the first thing about that analysis is that women, in fact, are equal, and it is society, its structures and its strictures, which restrict women, not biology or any other innate quality. And that's just the basis of that. No, there's a whole lot more to it, and I'll get into that a bit later. The next question to judge an analysis is it based on historical fact? Does the analysis offer an explanation that is consistent with historical data, consistent with other elements of the analysis of that same organization? And does this analysis explain the greatest range of phenomena to be understood? Okay. So in my article, I did not outline the analysis of which Marxists and the Communist Party of Canada bases its positions with respect to women and the achievement of women's equality. Most comrades and friends are aware of the theory outlined by Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. In brief, the theory proposes that the inequality of women arose with the advent of private property and the subsequent development of male control of that property. The key feature of this male control of property with respect to the inequality of women is the removal from women of access to the means of subsistence. For if women no longer have access to the means of subsistence, independent of their relationship to those who control property, then they are, by definition, dependent upon those who control property and control that access. This applies not only to women, of course. When capitalism and its colonial extension, colonialism, want to develop a working class dependent upon them for their existence, they must, and always do, begin by finding ways to deny those who they want to become their workers access to the means of subsistence. This is the history of the land enclosures in Scotland, the imposition of the hut tax in British-controlled Africa, the dispossession of the peasantry all over the world, is to remove them from their means of subsistence. According to the Marxist analysis, women become subservient to men when they are dependent upon them for their access to the means of subsistence. This subsistence develops alongside the development of class. So the analysis of women's inequality is inextricably linked to the Marxist analysis of class. Flowing from the development of the forces of production, which allowed for the creation of surplus, is the possibility, very quickly realized, of exploitation and thus of classes and the requirement of the state to maintain class oppression. The solution, according to Marxists, is the integration of the entire female sex into social production, not as individuals, because we all know that individual men and individual women, some are not able to work, but to integration as a category. The flip side of this solution, and similarly a demand of the party throughout its history, is the transformation of household labor into social production. So the question about the analysis and the source of the problems is clear. The party had one, and it was articulated, and it did address the issue of historical data. It responded to historical data, in fact, more than historical, anthropological data. The second criteria is the fidelity with which the policies reflect the analysis. In the case of the Communist Party, the policies that they worked to achieve were in fact consistent with that analysis. The analysis links women's inequality to their lack of access to the means of subsistence. Within capitalism, the source of the means of subsistence is a job. Almost all Communist Party policies were directed to gaining women access to employment and equal access to the jobs that were available, to equal pay, to social policies necessary to allow women to avail themselves of jobs, things like maternity leave and childcare. The Communist Party did not ignore the social issues important to women: access to healthcare, dental care, reproductive rights, educational opportunities. But the focus was always on winning women the right to economic independence through the participation in the paid workforce. Linked to those demands were demands that would transform the services previously provided within the home into social production: universal socially provided childcare, schools, after-school care, and similar demands. Again, the policies matched their analysis, and equally important, if achieved, would have in fact facilitated the goals of female integration into the workforce and the socialization of household labor, and the ability of women to join the struggle for the end to class oppression, as well as women's oppression as women. The third criteria is the role of the women within the organization. And to judge that means you have to take into account other variables. How many women were in the workforce at that time? How many women were workers who might have been attracted to a working class party? It was very small, something like 800,000. I have it in my article. I think it was 800,000 or something like that. I should find it, and I will at some point come back to it. But it was not very large. And what was significant is it was changing. The women's workforce was beginning to change from private service to work in the public sector, like needle trades and things like that. They were no longer just domestic workers. So that's one of the variables, but there are other variables. I mean, just the fact that women would have had less capacity to be involved by childcare, the lack of childcare, and the domestic responsibilities that had been maintained as theirs. But even within that fact, women were not and never have been insignificant to the Communist Party of Canada. In my article, I highlight some of the stalwarts, the leaders who of that time, the people who really stand out of that time, and who played important roles in the party and beyond. And it wasn't just the early days either. And this I want to, because in the article I outline, I don't have to do it here. Danny wants you to buy a subscription and get the journal and read it. But it wasn't just the early days. If one were to look at the party in the 1970s and 1980s, at some point during that time, the ideological leader was a woman. The editor of the theoretical journal was a woman. The leader of the party in Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec were women. The voice of the party in the peace movement And the leaders of the solidarity work in Cuba and Cuba and South Africa, all were women. And of course, today, the leader of the Communist Party is a woman. So in terms of looking at what role did women play, they played an important role in the party, but they played also an important role in the organizations which the party organized, led, supported, encouraged, did whatever. And these women were assigned into those organizations or asked to take roles within them, and they did, and they led those organizations. Some of them were significant leaders in it. I mean, and you know the names, the Becky Buhays and the Jean Corbins, who just were monumental in the roles they played. The organizations, Women's Labor League, which supported women and children of strikers, but went far beyond that to the struggle for peace, for instance, that Danny mentioned, the unemployed movement, organizing women into the needle trades. They were organizers for the trade union movement and struggles to raise the minimum wage of the day. The Ontario Labour College and the Montreal Labour College, the Canadian Labour Defence League, the Workers' Unity League, which was really a very significant one in which women played a very important role. The charter document of which shows, by the way, I thought this was very nice. The charter document of the Workers' Unity League is a picture of a man and a woman. Each one of them is clearly a worker shaking hands. And there's another button from the Workers' Unity League for unite and strike for better wages or something. And again, it was very clear men and women were in this struggle together. So in every one of those organizations, and I'll repeat a line I use in my article, women spoke and were heard, they wrote and were read, they led and they were followed. So in that criteria, we have it. The last criteria, I think, is the nature of the women's organizations which the party created and supported. And I've already listed some of them, but I want to speak about the one that I am familiar with, and in which was the organization that was created by the party here and which was linked through its international connections to the international Women's International Democratic Federation. That was the Congress of Canadian Women. The Congress of Canadian Women, the CCW, was affiliated with the WIDF, which was created in 1945 in Paris. And what's interesting about the WIDF was, one, that it was clearly, it clearly reflected the role of communists within it. There's just no question about it. First of all, it had as its core value anti-fascism and peace. That was where it started. But significantly about this organization, the people who showed up at its founding meetings in Paris came from all over the world. And not everybody had been part of the anti-fascist struggle or had experienced fascism. Many of them came from places where they actually were experiencing the colonialism and imperialism of the very forces who had defeated fascism, British imperialism, French imperialism, etc. And they brought that to that conference and but raised that issue on the floor. And to its internationalist credit, the WIDF immediately halted and said, okay, we're going to investigate that. And they set up an international commission which traveled the world for the next couple of years, interviewing women and interviewing women's organization. And henceforward, from that day on, that organization was anti-fascist, pro-peace, anti-colonialist, and always massively supporting the struggle of women all over the world to achieve their equality, recognizing all the time that the conditions under which they worked and the conditions under which they lived were significantly different. So they didn't have a prescription for how that struggle would be carried out. The organization continued to play a role in the women's movement until late in the 1980s, where you know what happened in that period, although it is still alive. In the late 1980s and early 1990s was the period of the beginnings of the third wave feminism, with movements reflecting socialist feminism, radical feminism, and always bourgeois feminism. Throughout of this period until its demise, the CCW not only did not identify itself as communist, but did advocate for policies consistent with a Marxist analysis: jobs, childcare, maternity leave, equal pay for work of equal value, an end to the various barriers to work and advancement. It recognized the massively destructive consequences of racism on its victims, especially racialized women, and the violent and shameful legacy of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. It was also always recognized the international character of the class struggle, and similarly understood the importance of the struggle for peace as integral to the women's struggle as much as to the class struggle. And then, so to go back to the five criteria, if you take a look at them as a package, I think that if you package that up, it signifies a legitimacy to the claim to represent the interests of women who seek social, political, and economic equality as women, but also as workers. Then there can be no doubt, if you look at them, that the Communist Party of Canada has the greatest right to make that claim. It has the greatest right to carry the banner, to have carried it then, to have carried it throughout its history. And if we're able to maintain our focus on the historical materialist analysis of the source of the problem, the character and the dimension of the problem, and the policies which will address the problem, we will be able to continue to carry it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. I'm sure the people at home are clapping. And thanks for the overview and the step back. So comrades can read Jean's article in the current issue of The Spark, which is not duplicated by her presentation. So we'll go to the next speaker and author. This is Comrade Adrian Welsh, who is the leader of the Parti Communiste de Québec. He's also a Central Committee member of the Communist Party of Canada. So Adrian, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Drew. Good afternoon or good morning, comrades. Out of respect for the people that surely, some of them at least, who are unilingual francophones and who are watching us right now, and also out of respect of the topic that I am going to cover, I will try my best to be bilingual in my remarks. Donc, camarades, comme je le disais en anglais, je vais essayer autant que possible d'être bilingue dans mes commentaires, dans mes remarques, par respect d'abord pour les personnes qui sont unilingues francophones qui nous écoutent, et aussi par respect au sujet que je vais traiter. L'histoire du capitalisme est transcendée de deux grandes contradictions. L'une s'articule autour de la confrontation entre l'impérialisme et la nation, la domination et l'oppression, entre la souveraineté et la vassalité. L'autre s'articule autour de la fracture entre la classe ouvrière et la bourgeoisie, le capital et le travail, le capitalisme et le socialisme. C'est la contradiction fondamentale, celle qui transcende le monde contemporain. Il arrive toutefois que cette contradiction fondamentale soit, par moments et dans des conditions précises, la contradiction principale. C'est notamment le cas des peuples et nations colonisés, des États dirigés par une bourgeoisie compradore, dont la vassalité aux puissances impérialistes empêche l'achèvement de la révolution démocratique bourgeoise et le processus de libération nationale. C'est aussi le cas des pays sous occupation fasciste lors de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. De tout temps, les communistes ont eu pour défi de manœuvrer autour de ces deux contradictions et d'analyser la relation dialectique qui les unit, et ce, dans le meilleur intérêt de la classe ouvrière et de son combat pour le socialisme. Autrement dit, on peut dire que la question nationale prend racine dans la question de classe et que la question de classe nourrit et se nourrit de la question nationale. When we talk about the national question, we cannot do so without talking about the class question. In fact, we have to take it from a class-based perspective, for otherwise we fall into either big nation chauvinism or into small nation narrow nationalism. Before talking about the national question in Canada more precisely, I will give an overview of what we as Marxists and as Leninists see as a nation and what is an oppressed nation. So a nation from the Marxist point of view can be comprised as a stable group of people that share the following 5 characteristics. One being a common history, one being a common territory, one being a common language, a common economy, which does not mean that it has to be an autarcic economy, but rather a unified economy by opposition to a fractioned economy as was the case under feudalism, and also a sense of belonging to the nation, which is seen as a common culture. Pour comprendre la question nationale, il est important d'abord d'identifier ce que c'est qu'une nation, ce que nous on comprend par nation en tant que marxiste et en tant que léniniste. Et on peut comprendre la nation comme un groupe stable d'individus partageant les 5 caractéristiques suivantes: une histoire commune, un territoire commun, une langue commune, une économie commune et un sentiment d'appartenance qui se manifeste par une culture commune. De ces 5 caractéristiques, un constat important se dégage. La question nationale est à la fois une question objective et subjective. Ces 5 caractéristiques doivent en effet impérativement être partagées. Ainsi, il ne suffit pas de partager les caractéristiques qui sont objectives, territoire, langue, économie, de même qu'il ne suffit pas d'en partager les caractéristiques subjectives, histoire, culture, pour former une nation. Il serait donc illusoire de prétendre que l'existence d'une nation puisse être décrétée indépendamment par le groupe concerné ou par un groupe extérieur. Au contraire, l'existence d'une nation repose à la fois sur une reconnaissance subjective comme objective du fait national. If we take these 5 characteristics and the fact that these 5 have to be met for a group to become a nation, what we can draw as a conclusion from this is that the constitution of a nation is not solely an objective process, it's also a subjective process. For it's not enough to only share the objective characteristics, territory, language, economy, as well as it's not enough to only share the subjective ones like history and culture to be a nation. So a nation, in other terms, cannot be self-existing, but it cannot also be imposed from above and from outside. Si on prend ces caractéristiques, ce qu'on comprend, c'est que le Canada est un pays multinational. Il n'y a pas, pour ainsi dire, de nation canadienne. If we take these 5 characteristics and apply them to the situation in Canada, what we are forced to see is that there is no such thing as a Canadian nation. There are many nations in one country. Par contre, si on analyse l'histoire du Canada et si on analyse aussi l'existence de ces nations et les relations qu'elles entretiennent les unes avec les autres, force est de constater que ces nations entretiennent des relations inégales. However, if we analyze the relationship between all these nations, what we see is that the relationship that they have one with each other is one of inequality. In other terms, in Canada, there is one nation that is the dominant nation, and there are many other nations that are the oppressed nation. Au Canada, il y a une nation qui est dominante, la nation canadienne anglophone, et plusieurs autres nations qui sont opprimées. Et maintenant, pour comprendre cette relation, il faut comprendre aussi ce que c'est qu'une nation opprimée. But to understand what this relationship, we need to understand what is an oppressed nation. Une nation, la question de l'oppression nationale, ce n'est pas seulement une question économique, ce n'est pas seulement une question de développement, ce n'est pas seulement une question de degré d'oppression ou de degré de misère ou de degré de sous-développement. Une nation opprimée du point de vue des communistes, d'un point de vue marxiste, d'un point de vue de classe en fait, c'est une nation à laquelle est nié le droit à l'autodétermination jusqu'à et y compris le droit à la sécession, c'est-à-dire à la séparation. An oppressed nation is not, we cannot define a nation as oppressed only based on economic criteria. We cannot base it on the level of development or underdevelopment. We cannot base it on the level of how, in short, of any sort of only social criteria. It's also a very political question, and a nation that is oppressed is a nation to which is denied the right to self-determination up to and including secession. Up to and including secession might sound a mouthful, might sound like it is something that we are being repetitive, but it's not. This is the key point. Up to and including secession. In the same way that if two partners decide to contract a marriage, it is only if the two have the right to divorce that we can say that the marriage is consented and free. Well, it's the same with the nation, the situation with the nations and the national question. And the fact is that Canada surely is a forced marriage. It's a country that was built at the point of a gun. De la même façon que le droit à l'autodétermination jusqu'à y compris la sécession détermine le fait qu'une nation soit souveraine ou pas, le fait qu'elle soit opprimée ou non. C'est la même façon qu'on peut identifier si dans un mariage, les deux partenaires sont égaux. Pour qu'ils soient égaux, il faut que les deux aient droit au divorce, sans quoi c'est un mariage forcé. Justement, le Canada, c'est une histoire d'un mariage forcé. Encore pire, c'est une histoire d'un mariage forcé et qui a été signé de force au bout d'un fusil. J'ai parlé de la question de la nation dominante, qui est la nation canadienne anglophone. Et maintenant, si on veut s'attaquer et que ce soit clair, les nations qui sont opprimées, ce sont les nations québécoises, acadiennes, métisses et les différentes nations autochtones. So I said that the dominant nation in Canada is the English-speaking Canadian nation, but to be clear, the oppressed ones are Quebec, Acadia, the Métis Nation, and the different Indigenous nations that live on this land. À qui profite l'oppression nationale? To whom does national oppression benefit? La réponse à cette question est assez claire, et c'est aux grandes compagnies, aux monopoles. The answer to this question is quite easy. It is to big monopolies. And for this, I have a text by Stanley Ryerson that is not in the article, but I can read to you, and then we will comment. So this is Ryerson in his book, The Founding of Canada. The labor from which this first Canadian monopoly drew its fabulous profits was primarily that of the native Indian tribes of the Northwest. Their hunters and trappers tracked down the beaver, otter, mink, marten, and fox. The women scraped and prepared the pelts, and with their children carried the burdens on the long trek to the trading posts. In the 1780s, it was estimated that the annual shipment of beaver to England totaled more than 100,000 pelts. Often, wrote the trader and explorer Alexander Mackenzie, they suffered intolerable fatigue and innumerable hardships and were sometimes even starved to death. The Plains Indians, hunting the buffalo and making the pemmican on which the company's whole trading and transport system in the West depended, bartered this pounded meat and grease for liquor, tobacco powder, balls, knives, etc. The friendship and cooperation, a company statement noted, is necessary to the support of the trade. They alone supply all the food on which they would be compelled to abandon 3/4 of the country and all the valuable part of the trade. Reduced to dependence for their survival on European trade goods, the tribes were not only fleeced by the company, but also were incited to fratricidal strife. The Indians with whom we trade, report Joseph Frobisher, are equally at war with distant nations to the westward, which the traders generally encourage because on their return they come over a vast tract of country and bring with them large quantities of fine furs. If exploitation of Indian peoples through swindling and extortion was the main foundation of the trade in furs, the exploitation of wage labor in the work of transport between Montreal and the Pays d'en Haut, or upper country, was an essential part of the business Some 1,200 servants of the company, French-Canadian voyageurs or canoemen, interpreter, guides, carried the trade goods and the traders to the distant posts and brought back the great loads of pelts. These men toiled across the greater part of a continent by way of hazardous water courses and over back-breaking portages or carrying places. In 1791, the company sold in London for £88,000, first that had cost them about 16,000. So what we can understand from this is that Canada is a country that was built for the interests of monopolies, and that as early as the 1700s, and on the back of waged labor, as well as the theft of indigenous land and resources. Ce qu'on peut comprendre de cet extrait, que j'aurai pas le temps de traduire malheureusement, c'est que finalement le Canada, c'est un pays qui a été créé pour les grandes entreprises, pour les grands monopoles, sur le dos du travail salarié et sur le vol des terres et des ressources autochtones. So in that, and this was as early as 1774, but of course that continued on many aspects. A lot of these aspects are described in my article. Évidemment, ça c'était donc l'extrait dont j'ai parlé en 1774. Évidemment, ça a continué et ça continue aujourd'hui. Et il y a plusieurs exemples de comment ça a continué à travers les temps dans mon article, que évidemment je vous invite à lire. Mais dans ce contexte, ce qui est important de comprendre, c'est que seul le Parti communiste a été capable de comprendre qu'il y avait un lien entre oppression nationale et exploitation capitaliste. What's important to understand is that our party was and still is actually the only one who recognizes that there is a link between national oppression and capitalist exploitation. Et c'est fort de cette conclusion que nous avons su adopter des politiques, des positions et nous engager dans les luttes en partant du principe suivant qui est celui de garantir le droit à l'autodétermination jusqu'à y compris la sécession, tout en mobilisant en même temps, car l'un nourrit l'autre, tout en nous mobilisant pour l'unité la plus totale de la classe ouvrière au-delà des différentes nations au Canada. And so it is from that conclusion, from that link between capitalism and national oppression, capitalist exploitation and national oppression, that we were able to fight and to adopt the correct policies that make the link between the recognition, the full recognition of the right to self-determination up to and including secession of all nations that recognize Canada, that comprise Canada, sorry, while at the same time putting forward the unity of the working class beyond the national question. La vérité, c'est que pour que cette unité soit réelle, que ce soit pas une unité de façade, une unité qui a été imposée d'en haut, il faut garantir le droit à l'autodétermination parce que ce n'est que si les nations sont égales les unes aux autres que cette unité peut être réellement féconde et nous amener vers la victoire finale, celle du socialisme. À ce sujet, je pourrais vous rappeler, camarades, que lorsque la révolution d'octobre a lieu en Russie, entre le pouvoir soviétique de 1917 jusqu'à la formation de l'Union soviétique en 1923, les républiques socialistes soviétiques étaient des républiques complètement indépendantes et les relations qu'elles entretenaient les unes avec les autres, mais aussi avec la Russie bolchevique, étaient à travers des traités internationaux. So it is only for we have the right to self-determination that we can really achieve the national equality, the equality and the unity of the working class. And because otherwise it is imposed from top to bottom unity that will not allow the working class to fight together towards its common goal, being socialism. And on this, I should remind you, comrades, that in Soviet Russia, after the revolution, the relationship between the republics and the Russian, Bolshevik Russia and also between the republics amongst themselves, was one that was signed through international treaties. This is just to show that communists have never tried to impose the unity from top to bottom, while quite to the contrary, they patiently and tactfully maneuvered between to the best way to maintain the unity of the working class, in its internationalist principle, and also to maintain the right to self-determination. And of course, this is what we have done. Our party is the only party that has fought in our party is the only one that keeps fighting now against the Clarity Act, but we were also the only ones, the first ones also, to denounce the Wars Measure Act in 1970 when that happened. And also, even in the working class, our party was the only one in 1972, along with the Quebec's delegates, to fight for sovereignty and autonomy within the labor movement for the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec. Our party in Quebec has also a very positive track record of fighting and of taking the best elements of the national movement in Quebec towards progressive politics. We were the ones who first talked about the necessity for the working masses to have their own party, a federated party that would unite the left in Quebec beyond the national question. We put that on the map in the 1970s, but unfortunately, narrow nationalism and the surge of Parti Québécois put that on the ice. The reason being that they were able to convince part of the working class that they had more in common with the petit bourgeoisie rather than with the rest, their fellow workers in Canada, but that didn't last. That lasted only 20 years or so, because the working class eventually saw the real face of those who were as well their masters. And this is when the best elements of the working class movement of Quebec decided to join and to join us, the communists, as well as other leftist groups, to form the Union des Forces Progressistes. However, this too was short-lived, because all the potential was there to sidetracked by the narrow nationalist movement that tried to isolate the working class of Quebec from the rest of the working class in Canada. And this is in itself a trend that basically transcends the question of the national question in Quebec, and perhaps in any nations, in any oppressed nation, whether unity with national unity precedes class unity or class unity precedes national unity. But for us communists, it is class unity that is the most important, the one that we have to champion. Those who claim today to be sovereigntists and who claim that they are on the left even, they are the ones that are thinking that an independent Quebec would need to have an army that could be member of NATO. They are the ones who think that an independent Quebec could have the US dollar as its own currency. They are the ones who think that an independent Quebec would have better trade deals with the United States through and within NAFTA. So the question that we can ask ourselves is, what kind of sovereignty are they seeking? They're not looking for people's sovereignty. They're not looking for internationalist sovereignty. They're looking for a sovereignty that will suit the interest of their own class. And that with these people, we cannot ally. These people we have to fight. We have to fight their narrow nationalism, the same way that all over the country, we need to fight together against big nation chauvinism. And of course, this is what we communists of Quebec are committed to do. I'd like just to conclude saying that the national question is perhaps one of the most challenging ones for us as communists and for us as Marxists. This does not come from me. This is something that Yuri Andropov himself stated, himself being at the head of a country of over 70 nationalities and dozens of republics. He even said, he went as far as to say that it is a more tricky one and a more persistent one than that of the class question. And indeed it is, for the national question, it has a very important mobilizational potential. And now it is ours as communists to understand this and make the best use of those contradictions. And we should never forget that there is no such thing as a socialist revolution that is not somehow linked to certain aspects of the national question. The October Revolution was, amongst others, a victorious one thanks to the mobilization of smaller nations who wanted to put an end to Tsarist Russia, which was a prison house for nationalities. The people's democracies, or so-called people's democracies of Eastern Europe, they were built on the ashes of Nazism, fascism, and thanks to the work and the determination of communists who were part of the struggle against the Nazi occupation. In Vietnam, in Laos, and even in Cuba, it is the fundamental role that was played by communists in national liberation wars that allowed them to win the confidence of the masses. In Canada, let's be sure of that, comrades. It will be our capacity to correctly articulate our struggle against these two contradictions that are shaping the class struggle that is capital, labor, imperialism, nation, without forgetting that the fundamental one is capitalism versus socialism, capital, labor, and this is what is going to be our strength, and that will allow us to gain the confidence of the masses in this country, and especially of the working class.
Merci, Adrien. Thank you for those remarks and the reminder that the major struggle is to fight against big nation socialism, chauvinism in English Canada, and to continue that record, the proud record of the Communist Party of Canada over 100 years. I want to introduce Kimball Cariou, who will be the next speaker, kind of building a little bit on some of the presentation that Adrian just gave. He'll be speaking on a century of solidarity with Indigenous struggles. He is a member of the Central Committee, the current leader of the party in British Columbia, and until recently was the editor of People's Voice. Kimball, take it away.
Thank you, Drew. Yes, and thanks to Adrian for introducing the national question as one of our topics today. I was born on Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. My family background includes both European immigrants and Métis people on the southern prairies. I joined the party in 1972, and been on the central executive for nearly 30 years. I want to give an overview of this within my time frame. The era of European imperialist domination of this hemisphere began over 500 years ago. It's been an epoch of unrelenting popular resistance against some of the most brutal forms of oppression and genocide ever known. More than 5 centuries of huge struggles between colonizers and indigenous peoples, slave owners and slaves, bosses and workers. And the communist parties everywhere have been a part of these struggles for over a century since those parties were first founded. Contrary to the arguments by some critics, the founders of Marxism-Leninism had a very profound understanding of this reality. Recall this paragraph from chapter 31 of Capital, The Genesis of the Industrial Capitalist, where Karl Marx explained the link between colonialism and capitalism. He wrote, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in minds of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of black skins, are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Marx's wide studies of the record of European colonization in the Americas led him to conclude that the object was not simply slavery, but genocide. His view was that the chief goal of the English settler colonies in North America was the absolute extirpation of the indigenous population. We should not be naive about Canada's history in this regard. The westward expansion of the 13 colonies which formed the USA was a story of violent warfare lasting well over a century. But the openly stated aim of the Anglo-Canadian ruling class was to create a white man's country, a historic strategy, which had to include either the destruction of the indigenous peoples or their full assimilation. Physical or cultural genocide, in other words. This was part of the process of creating a capitalist economy which could maximize profiteering through the exploitation of labor and natural resources. Marx and Engels regarded the resistance of occupied and oppressed peoples as a key factor in the historic global struggle to end the barbaric system of capitalism. They were strong supporters of anti-imperialist fighters in Ireland, India, and other countries, and they were sharp critics of socialists who denied the importance of these national liberation struggles. Their views were part of the early framework of theories adopted by the groups of socialists who eventually came together to form the Communist Party of Canada. Most of these socialists were working class immigrants escaping from poverty or repression to seek a better future here. And many came from Tsarist Russia, the prison house of nations. Others were of Scottish or Irish origin, or from China or the Punjab region of India, with a common negative experience of British imperialism in particular. These experiences led them towards sympathy with the indigenous peoples whose lands had been stolen to allow for the expansion of capitalist profiteering on a vast scale. This was the source of Tim Buck's quote from his speech at the famous 1931 trial on charges of sedition, where he said that the bourgeois state was formed in Canada first to enforce the robber's will on the suppressed Indians and later on the working class. The early Canadian communists saw the oppression of indigenous peoples as part of the overall capitalist drive to divide workers and to exploit labor and natural resources. The extreme poverty forced upon indigenous peoples was seen by them as a moral outrage inflicted on victims of imperialist colonization, but also as a way for employers to expand the reserve army of the unemployed. The pages of communist newspapers from the 1920s and onwards include many reports on the poverty and brutality faced by indigenous peoples and about outrages such as the so-called residential schools. Our press often reported on protests around all these issues, which grew more common as the years went by. At the same time, the Marxist analysis of the national question in Canada was beginning to take shape. In the early years, the main focus was on the unequal union of English-speaking Canada and Quebec, to use the title of Stanley Ryerson's famous book. But Ryerson also helped to develop a broader Marxist understanding of the dispossession and oppression of Indigenous peoples, framing this not as a so-called dark chapter in our history, but as a crucial stage in the formation of the Canadian capitalist state. And I'll share this here. Cover of one of Stanley Ryerson's famous books. If you want to study these issues, this is one of the things that you look for. Ryerson was the first Canadian communist to study how European colonial powers and later the new Canadian state implemented the strategies of genocide and cultural assimilation. His book, The Founding of Canada, Beginnings to 1815, was published in 1960, but his research had already informed the party's expanding positions on the national question, both in regards to Quebec and Indigenous peoples. And these books were very popular, very widely read by all sorts of people in popular movements across Canada. During this period of Marxist research and writing, Indigenous peoples were openly defying the Indian Act, finding ways to organize resistance movements. Growing numbers of Indigenous and Métis workers were entering the workforce, especially in the resource sector. And as they became proletarianized, they inevitably made contact with radical-minded workers, and especially communists. This trend was notable among the Métis people on the prairies, who had been deprived of any land base of their own as a result of the oppression following the 1869-70 Riel Rebellion in Manitoba. There were also large numbers of working class Indigenous people on the West Coast. Rolf Knight's book, Indians at Work, is a pioneering study of people in the workforce. You should look for this one if you're interested in these issues. Just let me pull it up here. There it is, the cover of Indians at Work. Fascinating book on the nature of the Indigenous working class on the West Coast. Some of these people began to join the Communist Party during the early years of the Great Depression. The most famous were Jim Brady and Malcolm Norris, who were two of the initial founders of the Métis Association of Alberta. Brady and Norris helped to lead a campaign during the 1930s to force the Alberta government to establish Métis settlements. This was the first successful effort to reestablish a Métis land base on the prairies. The first real example of a land-back policy in actual practice in Canada. Brady remained an active communist in northern Saskatchewan until his death in 1967. In a 1960 interview, Brady said his politics were based on the idea that what we would refer to vaguely as the national liberation of the Indian peoples and the Métis people in Canada cannot be completed until Canada as a whole and the Western world as a whole free themselves of that vicious system which has imposed these conditions on a conquered people. He supported solidarity with the white working class against colonial capitalism, that vicious system, as he called it. Another example was Homer Stevens, the longtime leader of the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. Homer's grandmother was from the Cowichan First Nation on Vancouver Island. He was widely respected in Indigenous communities along the coast, where he promoted united action between the Union and the Native Brotherhood, which represented most fishermen from Indigenous communities along the coast. During those years, the Communist Party spoke out constantly against the social and economic inequalities imposed on Indigenous peoples. The party's 1943 convention adopted a resolution of full support for the Métis and Indian people in their struggle for full equality with other citizens of Canada, and records its sympathy for the program of democratic reforms as put before the authorities by their organizations. In 1959, the party issued a statement condemning an RCMP raid against the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy. The statement demanded the recognition by statute of the identity of the Indians as a people, with the full right of self-government on their lands, including control of property and civil rights, finances, welfare services, education, and cultural development. In short, of their fundamental right to determine their own way of life, including their association as Indians. A reference to the Indian Act, which left it up to the government to define who were Indians and who were not. This was the first time that a political party in Canada had explicitly declared support for the principles of Indigenous self-government and self-determination. During the late 1960s, the Red Power movement was associated with an explicitly anti-capitalist revolutionary vision, similar to the views of the Communist Party. The pages of the Canadian and Pacific Tribunes featured the fight against the Trudeau government's assimilationist white paper, as well as coverage of the foundation of the American Indian movement, the occupation of Wounded Knee, the arrest and deportation from Canada of AIM leader Leonard Peltier, and much more. And I'll show a couple of things. Let's see. Try and get back to what I'm looking for here. There, for example, is the booklet that we published, National Identity or Cultural Genocide, a reply to Ottawa's New Indian Policy by Ben Swanky, who was a researcher for the Communist Party in those days. That's just one of the things that we published at that time that's worth looking up. Another example, looking back to that time, was the coverage in our press of the Fred Quilt case. This was an Indigenous man in northern BC who died while in RCMP custody in 1971. This was one of the many cases of injustices against Indigenous people taken up by our party. In that case by the radical lawyer Harry Rankin, who was always associated with the Communist Party. I'll show you, this is autobiography of Harry Rankin, if you're looking for a very interesting presentation of the party support for these struggles. It's in that book. So in countless commentaries, resolutions, articles, policy statements, since that period and beyond, the Communist Party has expressed full support for Indigenous struggles against the corporate sector's resource and extraction export strategies. Our election platforms have publicized these positions to millions of people. And we've been in solidarity with many of the Indigenous resistance struggles which have accelerated in recent decades. The Oka summer of 1990 sparked a huge wave of solidarity tactics, such as occupations of local parks by supporters of the Mohawks, including by members of the Communist Party and YCL. In 1995, there were major protests against the RCMP attacks on the Tibetan defenders at Gustafson Lake in BC, and in Ontario against the police shooting of Dudley George at Ipperwash Provincial Park. Indigenous peoples in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and elsewhere have mounted constant struggles to defend traditional fishing rights. The Caledonia land dispute in 2006 saw an escalation of efforts by the Six Nations of the Grand River to defend their historic treaty rights. In late 2012, the Idle No More movement was born in response to the Harper Tory government's Bill C-45, which undermined environmental protections. Resistance by Wet'suwet'en land defenders and their allies against corporate and government-backed pipelines in their traditional territories led to rail and highway blockades across the country in late 2019, early 2020. These and many more struggles to defend Indigenous sovereignty rights and to protect traditional lands and waters have become increasingly common and have had the support of the Communist Party and the YCL across the country. I want to close with just reading a part from the chapter 4 of the updated program of the Communist Party on the national question. It says, the record of Canadian history continues to the present day in the form of assimilationist proposals for permanent elimination of inherent national rights, opening up reserve lands for private sale, and gradual absorption of Indigenous peoples into the broader population, all in contradiction of internationally recognized rights such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In this very real sense, the policies of colonialism, driven by and serving the interests of ruling circles in the European centers and working to benefit Canada's own bourgeoisie, are at the heart of the foundation of the Canadian state and remain in place in the 21st century. The original treaties signed by Indigenous peoples have been constantly violated, and the unceded traditional territories of those who never surrendered or signed treaties have been turned into crown lands for the profits of the big resource monopolies. The Indigenous peoples and the working people who came to Canada in search of a better life, only to be victimized by the big banking, railroad, and agribusiness monopolies, have a common enemy, the capitalist state and the big corporations, which aim to maximize profits through resource extraction and exploitation of workers. The Communist Party of Canada stands for the liberation of Indigenous peoples and other oppressed nations in this country, and for the unity of the working class of all nations and peoples to achieve genuine democracy, equality, environmental survival, and socialism. So for 100 years, that's been our very proud record. We aim to continue that and eventually to end socialism, which will liberate all oppressed peoples in this country. So thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kimball. And just a quick reminder, comrades, we are hoping to have a bit of a discussion at the end of the presentation. So if you have, I see some discussion in the chat, but if you want to turn that discussion into concrete questions or comments to bring up at the end of the presentations, that might help our discussion a little bit. So the next presenter is Comrade David Mckee, who is the current editor of People's Voice newspaper and a member of the Central Executive. Dave is going to be speaking on the Communist Party and struggles around the environment. Dave, take it away.
Thanks, Drew. This was the article that I wrote was called, I think, The Communist Party and the Struggle for Working Class Environmentalism. And I have to say it was a fascinating article to research and to look at party policy around that. It's, I think environmentalism has emerged as a consistent area of party work and organizing in roughly the last 3 decades. And that makes sense because it mirrors the development of a large body of scientific analysis that that highlights environmental destruction as an issue of public concern. And in fact, some argue, use the term, an existential crisis. But one of the things that makes it so fascinating to look at is that we can see that this is an area of political work that's seen a tremendous change in terms of both the science around it and how the Communist Party policy has developed in line with that. Obviously, Marxists have long understood the link between capitalist expansion and environmental degradation. Engels, many people are familiar with Engels' writing on this. Marx also wrote about it, including in his later works on the on the economy. And there's more recent Marxist analysis around it, written by people not limited to, but such as Andreas Malm, John Bellamy Foster. But as I say, the focus of my article was on the development of the Communist Party's analysis and work. And I identified that development as having 3 broadly defined moments. I just want to, before I say what they were, I just want to stress, it's not, it was a continuous development, I think. It's not a case where there was, ruptures and on this date, there was a decision made to abandon the prior policy and embark a new direction. I think it was very much a solid development that built upon each previous analysis. But the 3 general moments that I see are, the first one is I called environmental sovereignty. The second is looking at the environment or recognizing the environment as an issue in its own right. And that relates also to the view of the environmentalist movement. And the third is the specific promotion and development and promotion rather, of a concentrated working class environmentalism. And as I say, these emerged at different times or in different contexts within the party history, but they're all interrelated and they all develop or contribute to the forward propulsion of the party's policy and work in this area. So I'll just describe each of these, at least the first 2 very quickly, and then a little bit more on the third one. So environmental sovereignty. I think since the very first years of the party's existence, and for the first several years of the party's existence, discussion and action around the environment tended to be limited to or focused on natural resources and their relationship to economic development. And so work tended to be guided by the demand for nationalization of those resources and those industries as necessary measures for ensuring that economic growth occurred in a way that would benefit the working class. Excuse me, I should say that the policy, or this term, environmental sovereignty, is not a description that was used by the party. It's something that I sort of came up with retrospectively, but it's been expressed in different ways over several, in several different contexts. I think one of the most, excuse me, one of the most robust expressions of it was in the economic platform that was adopted by the National Convention of 1964. They were called national conventions then, not central conventions. And that policy called for repatriation of natural resources and their ownership by the people, public ownership and operation of resource industries. And it called for a national energy policy that would develop power resources in an east-west all-Canada electric grid. And so the main point here is, and there's a lot to read, it's really a lot of information, it's very interesting, but the main point is that from its earliest years, the Communist Party pressed for public ownership or nationalization of natural resources as a necessary step to ensuring their economic and social stewardship. And that's important because that insistence on the link between the environment, economy, and social security remains one of the main pillars of the party's environmental policy. So the second sort of moment that I talk about is recognition of the environment as an issue in its own right. And this really emerged in I think anyway, in about the 70s. So the 1960s and 70s were marked a shift in thinking around the environment. And this was largely because the effects of human activity were becoming widely apparent. Pollution of the air, pollution of water, hazardous waste, pesticides, they all attracted increasing scientific attention and became the focus of more and more activism. Excuse me. And for the party, these developments began to, I think, broaden our analysis so that recognize the environment as an issue in its own right, not just an element of economic policy. And I felt that this position was reflected early for example, in 1973, Alberta leader, then Alberta Party leader Bill Tomey, was at a conference of the party's 4 Western provincial organizations, and he gave a paper which placed the demand for environmental protection among the 5 key elements of a countrywide policy on energy. That's pretty important. Another interesting article was written by Ben Swanky in 1970 in Communist Viewpoint. Swanky, just as a side note, went on to become, in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s, one of the key promoters of liquidation. So, bear that in mind. But his writing in 1970 on the environment was pretty useful. And he identified pollution or environmental degradation as one of the most serious threats to human welfare. And he positioned the environmental struggle as an important conduit for confronting monopoly capitalism. So this marks, I think, a qualitative step forward in terms of the party's analysis. And yet the response to the challenge of that analysis, I think it's fair to say, was uneven. I think it took more than a decade for the issue to come fully present in party activity. And so a couple examples of this. In 1976, there was the Berger, I don't know if it's Berger or Berger, but the inquiry into the Mackenzie Valley pipeline. And the party made a submission. It was quite a robust submission. It talked about a lot of really good things. But the only reference to the environment was in a single sentence that called for protection of the environment and ecology of the North. And that's a gap. Similarly, during the 5 federal election campaigns from 1972 to 1984, those party platforms only once included a reference to the environment. I think that was in the 1974 election. And I want to just stress that it's not that the policies that were being advanced were bad. There was still, this idea of nationalization of natural resources, public ownership over resource industries. That was there, and those are still critical reforms. They're still critical now, but the approach was truncated in terms of the environment. And I think it's hard to look at that period and not conclude that there were some serious missed opportunities to develop a working class environmentalism, which would include class-based policies that we could have used more to engage the environmentalist movement and make it stronger, make it more radical, specifically more anti-monopoly and more anti-imperialist, give it that kind of shape. Those are struggles that were only increasing in their scope and intensity. And as I say, I think there was a missed opportunity there. I do think that one of the factors, probably a very big one, contributing to this lag in our concrete work was a lack of connection with the environmental movement, but also a lingering suspicion of the same. And there's all kinds of articles that I looked at in Viewpoint, for example, but also in past issues of the paper that described people describing the environmental movement as liberal and bourgeois and petty bourgeois, and very suspicious tone to it. But even then, there was a debate and a discussion on how to do that. And I want to point to a paper that was written in Viewpoint in 1987 by Miguel Figueroa. He was writing in the context of a party-wide discussion on a draft program update at that time, and he pointed to the tremendous growth in mass democratic movements, both in terms of including their militancy and their radicalism, and to their importance to the class struggle. And he made specific reference to the environmental movement, which he described those surging democratic movements as a political force alongside the workers' struggle. And I think that again, represented a certain step forward in terms of how the party views the social movements, the mass movements, including the environmental movement. And so, armed with this deeper understanding of the environment as an issue unto itself and the environmental movement as a legitimate element of progressive struggle, finally, in the 1988 federal election, the party projected quite a clear set of policies for the defense of the environment. It called for comprehensive cleanup, action against acid rain, penalties, stiff penalties for polluters, funding for conservation, bans on chemicals and clear cutting, a moratorium on nuclear power, a big list. But what's notable, though, is that this long overdue section was very welcome, but it honestly, when you read it, it seems more like the party at the time was reiterating social movement demands rather than a set of policies that reflected a Marxist analysis of the environmental crisis. I realize that's critical, but I mean, I think, development of policy and analysis is going to be uneven. There's going to be starts and stops and adjustments. But I do think we have to have a something of a sober analysis of that period of time. But that brings us then to the third moment, which is what I think is the current challenge before us, or the current element of party work, and that is to build a concentrated working class environmentalism. And the need to address the environmental crisis in a programmatic way through specifically vigorous and rigorous Marxist analysis was signaled early on in the party's new political discussion bulletin, or was then the new political discussion bulletin, which we now know as Spark. It's called Spark then too. And specifically an article in 1994 that Kimball Carrier wrote was quite interesting. It included a look at some of the instances of environmental degradation in the Soviet Union and other socialist states, as well as the ones that we see around us in capitalism. And Kimball concluded that a working class or Marxist environmentalism needs to go further than simply critiquing capitalism. And I'm going to read what he wrote. He said, industrial and other forms of economic activity cannot expand indefinitely without endangering the biosphere in which we live and exhausting our finite supply of resources. We need to develop a concept of socialism which is not based on ever-increasing accumulation of material goods. I think it's fair to say that represents a real step from some of the writing prior to then. But it's also important that this vision was reinforced roughly a year later in a position paper also printed in Spark, written by somebody writing as R.J. Rendell. And it was writing about a position paper on the environment relating to the updated party program. It was updated in 2001. And that paper by Rendell provided a detailed analysis of the impact of economic development on the environment. And it concluded that there are limits to the material consumption of humanity, to the carrying capacity of the environment. And it argued in the end that this reality necessitates limits on human activity. And it also argued that those limits must be accomplished through class struggle. This is an enormously important paper. And as I say, it fed into the program update, which took place in 2001. And that program included quite a robust, and still does include quite a robust section on the environmental crisis. Appropriately, it continues to critique capitalism as the main driver for causing massive destruction and extinction. And it specifically identifies the imperialist system as the fundamental cause of environmental degradation and resource use inequality. There is some critique of the experience of previous socialist societies, but it unquestioningly asserts the necessity of socialism for environmental security. I think one of the notable things about that program update in 2001 was that it identified and spoke to the need to resolve the tension between workers' economic demands and the need to protect the environment. And that this work is a key area of our efforts to advance the revolutionary struggle. And I think that really captures, that specific work captures what I mean by working class environmentalism. That programmatic direction in 2001 was further refined about 8 years later in the 2009 People's Energy Plan. And that was an effort to both update the longstanding economic policies, but also to reflect an integrated analysis of the current economic and environmental conditions. It placed a lot of emphasis on public ownership and democratic control of resources in all aspects of production, extraction, refinement, distribution, and sale. It also looked at the relationship between resource extraction and colonialism, so meaning colonialism in Canada, dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples, and also Canada's imperialist foreign policy of militarism and war. And that People's Energy Plan also took aim at capitalist solutions, quote, like carbon taxes and cap and trade, which really are just the commodification or marketization of the right to pollute. I think the most notable element, though, in the People's Energy Plan for us right now is its call, a very clear call for a deliberate economic transition away from fossil fuel use. And there was a whole series of reforms and actions that the plan identified as necessary. Those included a moratorium on tar sands and shale gas, progressive closure of existing tar sands and shale gas operations, opposition to oil and pipelines, an end to coal-fired and nuclear power generation, and a massive program to ensure a just economic and social transition for affected workers and communities. So just transition. Remember, this is 2009, right? This is 12 years ago. So just on this question of developing a concentrated working class environmentalism, there's no question this presents us as communists with a sizable dilemma. And that one of the big questions is, how do we give priority? On the one hand, how do we give priority to workers' struggles for jobs, wages, and benefits, while at the same time promoting strict limits on economic activities that provide those same necessities? And this is a challenge for us, right? We go and we talk to people who rely on tar sands jobs, say, hi, we'd like to close the tar sands. And there's a reaction to that. It's completely understandable. But engaging in that contradictory circumstance is precisely the task of the Communist Party, because we seek through concrete analysis of concrete conditions and the creative application of the science of Marxism to bring revolutionary consciousness to the masses. That's our task, and we can't shy away from this. There are some key questions which emerge about this question of this issue of working class environmentalism. Some of those are things like, the question of how do we theorize, how do we help build more theory, an effective theory about the environment from a working class or socialist perspective. And those relate to the theoretical gap, I think, relates both to political economy, where we face questions of our proposals around zero growth as a way to somehow solve the crisis. That is not a working class solution at all, unless we want people to live in mass poverty. But also there's the promotion of and the acceptance by many in the working class of capitalist solutions, cap and trade, carbon taxes, carbon trading, all of these things. These are not effective. They will not resolve or even help ameliorate in any radical sense the environmental crisis, and they certainly won't help working class people. There's also the question of theory around tactics. And I think this is really key. I think this is actually probably the area where it's under theorized most notably. And specifically what I mean is, how do we engage the working class and the labor movement into the struggle for climate justice, for environmental justice, from their own class point of view? Not that there's two streams, right? Here I am in my union or my working class struggle, and here's this other stream beside me, which is the struggle for climate justice, and it's also progressive. No, what we want to do is combine those into a river, a mighty river of working class environmentalism. And that will take a lot of work to do that. And it relates to other questions like just transition, but also broader questions like the national question and Indigenous sovereignty. So there is a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work being done. It's not like we're starting from zero. I'll just mention that the article that I wrote in Spark was, and some of the other ones as well, were published in People's Voice in a shortened form when we were publishing the articles on the Centenary. And the article on working class environmentalism was received quite positively. It's been picked up and published by a number of other outlets. And I was invited to speak at some online forums organized by communists in the United States. And I think that this shows the importance of the issue to Marxists, to communists, to the struggle for socialism. And there's a real appetite for building this and digging down and doing the necessary work. I also received some attacks for the article. People saying that, not a lot, thankfully, but people saying that this was revisionism to try to bring socialism together with environmentalism. And I have to say, I think this is hogwash. It represents a non-Marxist approach to Marxism. My response to it is to paraphrase Lenin's critique of economism in What Is to Be Done. Is to say that simply repeating either the spontaneous demands of the environmental movement or repeating the immediate economic demands of workers really amounts to simply facilitating the stagnation of socialist thought and the abandonment of huge sections of the working class to the domination of bourgeois ideology. It also abandons the entire human species to the destructive conclusion of unending capitalism. So yes, the politics of the climate and environmental crisis are contradictory. But as I say, it's precisely our task to engage in that contradiction and to do so in a way that brings revolutionary consciousness to the masses. Reflecting on the current COP26 conference, it is very clear that not only capitalism is not only the main driver of the climate and environmental crisis, but it is absolutely incapable of providing even meaningful approaches to ameliorate, let alone overcome the crisis. A livable environment requires socialism, and socialism requires a livable environment. And that's why we say that the working class has a world to win and a planet to save. And that's why the Communist Party has put its shoulder to the wheel to build working class environmentalism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave. And that generated some questions too. So it looks like you'll be talking later in the program. So yeah, thanks, comrades that are, I know there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat, try not to get into arguments there, but if you could try and move things towards a question or comments, that'll help us out in the next section. But before then, we have kind of the main event. We have Elizabeth Rowley, who's the leader of the Communist Party of Canada, and she will be speaking on the Communist Party and the working class. Liz, take it away. Liz, I think you're muted.
Correct. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Comrade Chair, comrades and friends, brothers and sisters. The history of the Communist Party is the history of working class struggle in Canada. A party of the working class and for the working class. Our goal is working class political power, socialism, in other words. While advocating for socialism as the only alternative to capitalism and imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the Communist Party has also fought consistently and tenaciously for economic and social reforms benefiting the working class and working people more generally. The Communist Party has fought to expose and defeat reactionary governments and large national and transnational corporations, working to increase profits by driving down workers' real wages and living standards, by dividing workers by race, gender, and nationality, by launching predatory wars to redivide the world amongst themselves and to resolve in their own favor the chronic economic crises that are a built-in feature of capitalism's boom-bust economic cycle. While fighting hard in the immediate struggles of working people, the Communist Party has never settled for short-term gains or reforms, never deviating from the goal of socialism as the only solution to liberate the working class from capitalist exploitation, oppression, and war. Reforms are by their very nature temporary and can be won or lost depending on the strength of organized labor and its allies relative to the strength of corporations and their governments. These struggles are important because of their immediate impact on the lives of working people and because they expose the real nature of capitalism. They are a school for collective action and organized class struggle. It's the job of communists to weld socialist consciousness onto the working class struggle and onto the working class movement, and in the process, to raise the struggle for immediate reforms to a mass political struggle for socialism. Reformism, on the other hand, is class collaboration and the dampening down of class struggle and independent labor political action with the aim of maintaining existing class relations and capitalism. Reformism concedes that the power of capital is immutable and permanent, and that small improvements in small bites are the only gains that workers can or should hope to achieve. Fundamental change that could dislodge capitalism, is rejected and opposed by reformists who insist that workers must work within the system to make any advances. In other words, the reformist prescription for change is class collaboration with the employers and their governments. Their goal is not to lead the workers' struggle, but to mediate between workers and employers within the framework of narrow collective bargaining, absent political demands or demands for system change. The struggle between the reformist and revolutionary streams of the working class movement has been a main feature in the labor movement over the past century, starting with the division over support for the imperialist powers at war with one another in 1914. Social Democrats and reformists sided with the capitalist governments in their countries, while communists recognized the class nature of the war, warning that workers' interests were with one another as an oppressed and exploited class, not with their exploiters and oppressors. This struggle is evident today as right-wing labor leaders continue to back Canada's aggressive foreign policy, supporting NATO and NORAD and Canada's involvement in US-led regime change operations around the world. As right-wing social democrats have embraced these policies in Parliament, reformists have promoted them in the labor movement. In sharp contrast, communists in the trade unions and in elected office have consistently worked to promote peace, disarmament, mutual security, and recognition of the sovereign right of nations to self-determination, including the right to take the path of socialist development. Further, communists have fought for the unity and solidarity of the international working class movement, recognizing the common interests of workers everywhere, as expressed in this call to action: workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains and everything to gain. The Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917 broke the chains of imperialism's global domination, gave birth to the world's first socialist state, and opened the global epoch of the transition from capitalism to socialism. Russia was the first to declare working class political power and to set forth the socialist path of economic and social development. For the first time in history, socialism ceased being only a theory and became a reality, a country that working people around the world could claim as their own. Within 3 months, Winston Churchill pulled together invading armies from 13 countries, including Canada, to destroy Soviet power and crush revolutionary Russia, along with the global grass fire revolutionary activity that Great October ignited. Communist parties were declared illegal organizations even before they were born, with Churchill's declaration that capitalist governments must, quote, smash the Bolshevik eggs in the nest before they hatch. But the working class refused to lie down, and instead the Hands Off Russia campaign took off, with many labor organizations raising money and supplies for Soviet Russia and expressing hopes for a socialist revolution and workers' Soviets here in Canada. That grass fire first led to the historic Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, which was a magnificent display of working class unity and militancy to secure fundamental change, but which was smashed by a military assault ordered by the federal government. The 30,000 strikers were routed, with hundreds injured and arrested. They had been lulled by anarchist elements into believing that a general strike would be enough to bring down the government and win their demands. The painful lesson learned was that the state was not neutral and would always serve the interests of the class in power, and that the strike weapon alone could not bring down the capitalist state. For that, a revolutionary political party of the working class based on scientific socialism was essential. The lessons of the strike helped galvanize Marxist and socialist-minded workers to get to work building Lenin's party of a new type, a communist party here in Canada. A unity conference was convened in early May, and on May 28th, 29th, 1921, the Communist Party of Canada was born, delivered by 22 delegates representing 650 members in a barn in Guelph, Ontario. The delegates voted to join the Communist International and the Red International of Labor Unions. Because the War Measures Act made the Communist Party an illegal organization, the Workers' Party was set up a few months later as the party's legal arm until 1924, when the CPC became legal for the first time. The Workers' Party adopted a 5-point program in 1922 that called for a workers' republic, working class political action, trade union unity, a party of action, and a party press. The party's newspaper, The Worker, was established a few months later. The party declared 3 main aims in its trade union work: maximum unity through industry-wide organization, broad-based democratic control with full involvement of the members of the members in trade union affairs, and Canadian autonomy in the trade unions whose international headquarters were in the US. During the early 20s, the Communist Party organized the Trade Union Educational League, which was affiliated to the Red International of Labor Unions, and whose purpose was to win support for the formation of militant class-based unions and to promote amalgamation of the industrial and craft unions with the goal of one union in each industry. In 1923, after just a year of organizing, the Trade Union Educational League had active groups in 16 trades and labor councils and in the BC logging camps, the coal mines of Nova Scotia and Western Canada, and the metal mines of Northern Ontario. The Trades and Labor Congress launched a ferocious attack on the Trade Union Educational League and the Workers' Party for aiming to, quote, poison the minds of the workers against the present trade union and labor organizations and ultimately make them instruments for the establishment of communism. Samuel Gompers also condemned the Trade Union Educational League, and the American Federation of Labor leadership attacked the proposal for amalgamation of craft and industrial unions, saying it was, quote, frankly revolutionary, and had for its ultimate purpose not only the destruction of the trade union movement, but the eventual overthrow of the United States. These attacks were a foretaste of what the class collaborationists and reformist leaders in the US and Canadian trade union movements would dish out for the next 100 years. But they couldn't stop the surge of struggle and militancy that the Trade Union Educational League's growth and influence inspired. Their program called for organizing the unorganized, for building a shop stewards movement with active shop committees of rank and file members in every workplace, for united and independent labor political action, for Canadian trade union autonomy, for the affiliation of every trade union to the Trades and Labor Congress, for building a workers' press, including shop papers, for world trade union unity, for the nationalization of industry, and for the abolition of capitalism in favor of socialism. The Trade Union Educational League's program was endorsed by organizations representing 1/3 of the trade union movement of the 1920s. And by 1925, 50% of Canadian union locals had declared themselves in support of amalgamation and Canadian autonomy. In 1921, the Canadian Labour Party was born, a federated party of labor comprised mainly of communists and social democrats. It won great influence among workers in support of its call for unemployment insurance, nationalization of the banks, and other radical demands before it was scuttled by right-wing social democrats opposed to unity with the communists. Instead of cooperation, they went on to form the CCF in 1931 to compete with the growing influence of the Communist Party and the Trade Union Educational League in the working class and in the electoral arena. Though its life was relatively brief, the Canadian Labour Party showed that a federated party of labor had the potential to become a powerful political force in Canada's parliament. During the early 20s, the Workers' Party set up the Federation of Women's Labor Leagues for the purpose of organizing women into trade unions, mobilizing strike support, and building the movement for peace amongst women workers. In 1923, the Young Workers' League was established, later the Young Communist League. In 1925, the party set up the Canadian Labour Defence League, led by A.E. Smith and Becky Buhay, to defend workers in the Alberta coal strike. The Canadian Labour Defence League went on to defend the Estevan miner strikers in 1931, following the police murder of 3 strikers. Communist Party organizers Annie Buller and Sam Scarlett, who had been sent there by the Workers' Unity League, were sentenced to 1 year in jail with hard labor. In 1930, Tory Prime Minister R.B. Ironhill Bennett was elected, and in 1931 invoked the repressive Section 98 to declare the Communist Party illegal for the second time, and to arrest and incarcerate 8 communist leaders in Kingston charged with sedition. The 8 were finally released after prison guards attempted to assassinate Tim Buck during a prison riot. Tim was greeted by 25,000 people who flooded Maple Leaf Gardens on his release in 1934. The Canadian Labour Defence League defended the 8, as well as legions of union and political organizers, unemployed workers, strikers, and impoverished workers and farmers dispossessed of their homes and farms through the Great Depression. By 1926, the AFL was calling for the expulsion of communists from AFL unions. And by 1929, similar calls were issued by the Trades and Labour Congress in Canada. Workers were fed up with the reformist, collaborationist leadership of the AFL in the US and the Trades and Labour Congress in Canada. The Communist Party decided it was time to move beyond education and agitation and to start organizing the new industrial unions and new union centrals. With the advent of mass production industry in Canada, the need for industrial unionism was growing rapidly. The Trade Union Educational League reorganized itself as the Workers' Unity League in January 1930, with Tom McEwen as its national secretary, after strikes in the auto and steel plants of Oshawa and Hamilton had resulted in the local unions spontaneously pulling out of the AFL's international craft unions, only to be put back into the same craft unions by the Trades and Labour Congress in Canada. The Workers' Unity League's purpose was to organize the unorganized workers in the mass production industries into powerful industrial unions under rank and file control, to defend and advance their living and working conditions, and ultimately to further the overthrow of the capitalist system. It had a major focus on internal union democracy and membership control. It had a fraternal relationship with the Red International of Labor Unions and was itself a militant labor central, which workers could join, quote, regardless of race, creed, color, sex, craft, or political affiliation. The only obligation was to support the program of the Workers' Unity League. While the reformist unions lost members, the Workers' Unity League grew rapidly with a membership of 40,000 by 1934. The Workers' Unity League was leading 90% of the strikes in Canada between 1933 and 1936. It led 181 of 233 strikes in 1933, winning 111 of them. Every major strike in the country between 1930 and 1936 was led by the Workers' Unity League. Key strikes after Estevan were the Stratford Furniture Strike, the 1934 miners' strike in Flin Flon, where Bill Ross, future leader of the Communist Party in Manitoba, was sentenced to 6 months in jail for unlawful assembly. In 1935, the Workers' Unity League led the miners' strike in Corbin, BC, where police attacked a demonstration of miners and their families and then arrested, fined, and jailed 24 of them. The Workers' Unity League laid the basis for the organization of the large-scale industrial unions in auto, steel, mining, lumber, textile, shipping, woodworking, furniture, fur and leather, garment, and other mass production industries. The Workers' Unity League took up the job of organizing the unemployed with the goal of uniting the struggles of the employed and the unemployed. The National Unemployed Workers Association was set up as an affiliate of the Workers' Unity League. Mass protests of tens of thousands were held across the country in 1930 to 31. The key demands were jobs and non-contributory unemployment insurance. The Relief Camp Workers Union was set up in 1930 with its own newspaper and the goal of organizing the workers on relief. The Relief Camp Workers Union demanded better conditions, unemployment insurance, social insurance, better pensions, disability and sick pay, and a family allowance. In April 1935, 2,000 relief camp workers arrived in Vancouver, occupying the post office, the library, and the Hudson's Bay Company for 2 months of rallies and demonstrations before 1,000 of them left Vancouver on the On to Ottawa trek. Led by Workers' Unity League organizer Slim Evans, they held meetings and built support for their demands at every whistle stop along the way. Of course, they rode the rails. When 2,000 truckers reached Regina, they were stopped by police and the military, while a delegation of 8 led by Evans continued to Ottawa, where they were attacked by R.B. Bennett, who refused to hear their demands. Immediately, 800 unemployed from across southern Ontario hit the road, walking 250 miles to Ottawa, while truckers from Winnipeg were turned back by police at the Ontario border. Those held in Regina were surrounded by police with machine guns, then attacked and beaten, with more than 100 shot by police and 117 arrested. Mass protests of workers, farmers, and the unemployed swept the country, leading to R.B. Bennett's defeat in the 1935 federal election. The charges against the truckers were dropped. The new government of Mackenzie King was compelled to close the relief camps, rescind Section 98 in 1936, and to introduce unemployment insurance legislation in 1940 and the family allowance in 1945, the first universal social program in Canada. Many of the truckers, including hundreds of communists, went on to fight in the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion for the Republican cause in Spain, and many died there. By the mid-30s, the Communist Party was firmly established in the minds of workers as an unshakable champion of the rights and interests of the working class, the farmers, and the unemployed. 1935 marked the beginning of a new stage in trade union organizing in Canada. The Workers' Unity League dissolved and took all of its affiliated unions into the US-based Congress of Industrial Organizations, where industrial unionization moved forward quickly. Some of the most important battles in labor history took place during the following 2 years to secure the right to organize and for union recognition by employers and governments. In 1936, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee was formed in Canada, with Communist Party organizers in Hamilton, Ontario, leading the drive to organize Stelco, Dofasco, Steelcar, and other mills and shops. The first meetings took place in the Ukrainian Labor Temple on Barton Street, led by Communist Party organizers Harry Hunter, Harry Hamburg, Tom McClure, Dick Steele, and others. In Nova Scotia, George McEachern led the organizing drive in Sydney. By 1937, SWAC had 9,000 members in Ontario and Nova Scotia. The Canadian Seamen's Union, United Mine Workers of America, Mine Mill and Smelter Workers, the IWA, UE, UAW, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, International Ladies Garment Workers were all organized under the umbrella of the CIO in Canada, with heavy involvement of Communist Party organizers, including Harold Purchett, Harvey Murphy, Bruce Magnuson, Marc Leclerc, Harry Racketti, Charlie McClure, Tom Hill, Harry Timchishin, Jack Quinn, Mike Reshevich, J.B. McLaughlin, Jan Lakeman, James Sloan, John Stokalak, Bill Ross, Jim Coleman, Mabel Marlowe, Jean Corbin, Annie Buller, George Harris, Ross Russell, Jean Paré, Dewar Ferguson, Gordy Lambert, Jock Turner, Lloyd Peel, Alex Perront, Jack Taylor, Roy England, Cyril Prince, Mike Kennedy, Leah Roback, and Homer Stevens, and many others. One of the most significant struggles took place at the GM plant in Oshawa in 1937, when the workers went on strike for 17 days. The company finally capitulated and the UAW was recognized as the bargaining agent. This opened the door to union recognition in many industrial workplaces, and union membership soared despite red baiting and union busting by employers and governments. By the end of 1937, the CIO had an affiliated membership of 76,000 in Canada. Well, comrades, the militant and principled struggles led by the Communist Party, which won fundamental rights and gains for the working class, while simultaneously laying out the perspective and goal of working class political power, of socialism. And just the first 20 years of the Communist Party's life are just a taste of the 100 years of history of the Communist Party and the working class in Canada. To know more, you'll need to subscribe to the Spark, or better yet, to join the Communist Party and be a part of that continuing struggle for working class emancipation and socialism in Canada. There is a bonus in this, and it is that the next 100 years will include the victory of the working class, the achievement of its emancipation, the establishment of working class political power, and the building of socialism in Canada. Well, it doesn't get better than this. We stand on the shoulders of many communists who've gone before and who built a class-oriented, class struggle trade union movement in the Workers' Unity League, in the early CIO unions, and in the communist-led unions such as UE, Mine Mill, UFAWU, and others that fought through the Cold War, helped organize women workers, supported the public sector unions, built the left caucuses, fought for recognition of Quebec's status as a nation at the CLC, fought for the Common Front in Quebec and for the 1976 general strike across Canada, fought for policies of peace and disarmament, and who fought for solidarity with the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, for Cuba, for Chile, Grenada, Nicaragua, Colombia, and for Vietnam, Palestine, Venezuela, Haiti, and so many more. This is the history of the Communist Party of Canada. It's the history of class struggle in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Liz. As you can see, there's a tremendous amount of research that went into all these articles. So I just want to, Liz already made the pitch, but I want to reiterate it here. I am going to share with you my computer screen, so just bear with me. Where is it here? Okay, it should be here. So this is how to subscribe to the Spark magazine if you're not already a subscriber. So you should be able to see that. So this is the Spark fairly austere website. If you type the Spark Communist Party of Canada into Google, you'd probably get here pretty easily. But this is the latest double issue of the magazine. So it's 2 physical copies. This is 33. You've got Annie Buller there giving her speech to the Estevan miners that was so fiery it got her a year of hard time in prison, hard labor in prison. And you get this other issue 34. And the articles are written, most of them are written by the comrades we've heard from today. And most importantly, here's the subscribe information. So you get 3 issues for a very good deal of $20 Canadian. That includes postage, $25 if it's to the United States. Individual copies are $7 each. Or you can get, if you just want the Centenary issues, you can get those for $12. So you can send an e-transfer, for many comrades that might be the easiest, to newlaborpresscanada@gmail.com. Be sure to include your address and email and make the password Spark. Don't be too creative with the password, just stick to Spark, please. And you can subscribe the old-fashioned way, make a check or money order out to New Labour Press. That's who publishes the Spark, and that's 290A Danforth Avenue, Toronto, Ontario, M4K 1N6. So my other announcement before we get back to some of the discussion and questions has to do with actually one of the questions that was asked in the chat, and that is about the upcoming documentary that has been promised this year. So we mentioned this, I think, at our May meeting on the centenary of the party, and this is now a full feature-length film. And comrades put a lot of effort into their articles for the Spark, but also there's been a pretty big team working on what is now, well, to me, a studio quality full-length feature film on the documentary of the party. And I've seen what close to final cut, and it's nearly ready to go. But unfortunately, there's still a little more audio work that needs to be done. But the plan right now is to have it out before the end of the year, so still in this centenary of the party. And we're looking at about a month from now, so a little bit before the holidays. So here's the trailer if you didn't catch it in May when it was first shown. Here it is right now.
There was a moment when I thought that I was the last Leninist in the world.
There is a real test of a person. See, anybody can be revolutionary when the situation is revolutionary. Anybody can be revolutionary. It's more difficult to be revolutionary when the conditions are not revolutionary. When people are filled with reformist ideas and reformist illusions.
There was this impression that Marxism was dead, socialism was dead, and by extension, communist parties were dead as well. And in fact, we know that some communist parties actually did disappear.
You can't kill an idea. And the idea of people having a society in which the means of production are not owned by a parasitic class, that idea is, you can't kill it.
A lot of us came out, kind of battle scarred.
May suffer defeat, setback, but ultimately, in the competition between capitalism and socialism, ultimately, socialism will win.
Well, we live at a moment in human history when it's quite clear capitalism has absolutely nothing left to offer the people of this planet.
This is a class war.
Change is definitely in the air.
You might say that we were a little bit ahead of our time.
We are going to fight like hell for every single policy I've read here and some that aren't here.
The party has a real history of struggle in this country.
We are a revolutionary party striving to win the people of this country for socialism.
I remember very well going to my party club and meeting comrades, some of whom were in the Mackenzie-Papineau brigades fighting against fascism in Spain. People who were in the forefront of building the trade union movement.
When I think back on my life in the party, it just seems like a blur. We were involved in so many things. almost every major campaign.
When I joined the Communist Party of Canada in 1959, the Cold War was in full swing.
Taking our country out of the camp of imperialist war and fitting it into the camp of peace and progress towards socialism.
I feel I've never been anything but a member of the Communist Party.
I believe in socialism, and I believe that when you attain socialism, you should defend socialism.
A movement that isn't just through time, and our party has 100 years, and I'm part of that 100 years, and that's what feels significant to me, is this connectivity to history, but also through space.
Vive la solidarité internationale!
You know, it's not just a rhetorical slogan to say that we really are an internationalist movement, that we are one large family worldwide.
My roots are in India, my head is in Canada, but my heart is in Cuba.
Jim continued the fight for national liberation for the Indigenous peoples right up to the end of his life in the late 1960s. He's an inspiration for all of us who have Métis families in our backgrounds, and for all party members, in fact, that we've been in this struggle for almost our entire century.
I was infused with that worldview, you know, like which class do you belong to?
And there was quite a campaign.
Someone asked me, why are you running? Is it to raise issues, or do you want to get elected? And I said, I want to be elected.
The party has made it possible for me to follow my star. That is to say, to devote my life to work for my ideal, for socialism. And how many people have an opportunity to give every day of their lives to work for something they believe in?
I'm telling you that it's the party of the future. It's the only party that they can actually save the world, in my opinion.
So, comrades can tell probably by that trailer why it's taking a little longer and why it'll be worth the wait, but we're all very excited for December when that will be discussed.
Good evening, I'm Andrew Chang.
And I'm Adrian Arsenault. Tonight, Canadian
Automatic
snowbirds
YouTube playing.
are
Hold on, just give me 1 sec.
How long have you been in line here? 6 hours. U.S. land border reopens.
Technical
amid
problem.
More pressure to do away with COVID test requirements.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, comrade. It just automatically went to play for the national on CBC, but this is much more interesting than the national. So I just want to quickly maybe talk a bit about how we're going to do this discussion. There was quite a bit of discussion that kicked off partway through the presenters into the chat. So I don't have any great way to summarize it for the presenters. So I'm thinking maybe I can just run through some of the discussion. I've taken some notes, and then the comrades that are the presenters could put up their hand and try and answer maybe the bits and pieces that are closest to your presentation. So I will do that now in terms of what came up in the discussion. So there was a question about Jim Brady's death. That was Kimball's presentation, talked about Jim Brady and whether or not there was foul play involved there or the RCMP. There was questions about Harry Rankin. Was he a party member or not? I know that's a hot topic. Then there was some broader discussion about natural resources ownership and Indigenous people. What would, Indigenous stewardship of natural resources and public ownership, state ownership, what would that kind of look like in terms of agreements or under socialism, I guess, or under at least an anti-monopoly government. Nuclear energy, always plenty of discussion on that one. I guess that's more Dave's presentation that kicked that one off. So how do we talk about nuclear energy in the context of climate change when it's not a carbon emitting power source? What are socialist solutions to energy production? There was questions about, Dave mentioned degrowth in his presentation. There's a recent documentary that came out last year, I think, Planet of the Humans, that advocates degrowth or some form of degrowth. So what are the limits on growth that we would see as part of socialist solutions? Then there was a bit of a discussion on the Green Party. You know, the Green Party is in the middle of this, what looks like another leadership battle. What if the Green Party was to move left? Are they a reliable partner for socialism, or to what extent is a political alliance possible with the Green Party or Green Party members? How does the party plan on drawing in women and other gender oppressed people into the struggle for socialism? Very broad question. Maybe Jean has some thoughts on that one, or Liz. And I think that's it. I haven't seen any new questions. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. And if the presenters could stick up their hand and try and answer what they want. I don't know if we'll be able to get to everything, but okay, Kimball, go ahead.
Well, I'll say a few words about Jim Brady and about Harry Rankin. Jim disappeared on the out on his trap line in 1967, I believe the year was, or 69, right, the late 60s. Didn't come back. He was a guy who, at that point in his life, he made his income as a fur trapper, and like a lot of people in the north, living off the land. He had a cabin in L'Orange up in northern Saskatchewan. Sometimes he would go out trapping with a buddy of his named Abby Halkett, who was one of the few white folks who lived in L'Orange, which was a very racist town at the time. And they were quite close politically as well as in their working relationship. It was never determined exactly what had happened to Jim. There was, given the times, assassinations of radical political leaders and so on, there was a lot of speculation that somebody had done in Jim Brady, but there was never any evidence of anything one way or another. The North is a dangerous place. A lot of people die out on trap lines, freezing or falling into rivers. I once almost died on a canoeing trip up there with comrades, so that was my one brush with it. There's the Glenbow Museum has a wonderful exhibition of photos of Jim Brady, just for those who want to know more about him and see some of those images. But unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever really be able to answer that question. Harry Rankin, he, after serving in the Second World War, he was one of those who fought his way up Italy against the Nazis. He came home and went to law school at UBC in Vancouver. In those years, you couldn't pass a bar exam if you remember the Communist Party. Harry was not the only one. He was a party member at that time. There were others. Elspeth Gardner, for example, was a well-known party member who went to law school at UBC. And then people, if they wanted to practice law, basically had to lie about it and keep their Communist Party membership hidden. For many years, it was known that Harry was part of a group of comrades who met with the party leadership here. I don't know how Harry's relationship ended. With near the end of his life, things got a little more complicated. He was always very close to the Communist Party. Whether he kept up his membership, that's a good question. Some things that the party did to survive over 100 years, people never talked about. We had to defend ourselves. We had to protect ourselves against CSIS, against the RCMP, against all sorts of attacks by the Canadian state. And there were times when comrades didn't talk about their membership. And, for many years, Harry was in that category. There may still be somebody alive who knows more details, but nobody, I don't think, in the current leadership.
Thank you, Kimball. Any other comrades want to tackle any of the myriad of unrelated questions we got?
Drew?
David. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
So there were a number of questions that related to the environment. So I thought I'd just kind of touch very quickly on on a few of them. But just in terms of the question of limits to growth, I think there's a difference between limiting growth and limiting development. And I think that what we are committed to looking at is limits to development. And doing so in a way that doesn't adopt degrowth or zero growth approaches. I mean, if you think of one of the features of capitalism is uneven development, which has condemned billions of people to incredible poverty and hardship. And I just think that, you know, for anybody to say, well, we need zero growth just is a very horrible acceptance of that situation for those billions of people. And we cannot do that. That is just not socialist. That is not working class. That is not necessary. But I think there are, and I think the party documents indicate that there are necessary limits to certain economic activities. And those may include, I think they do include, certain areas of the planet that should simply not be developed. I'm thinking of the Arctic as an example, you know, a very precious and sensitive ecosystem. In terms of nuclear energy, I mean, this is something that, you know, I think that the parties had a policy, the same policy essentially on nuclear energy since at least the mid to late 80s. And that is that it's not necessary in Canada. There are other options for energy development in Canada, and we don't need to have nuclear energy. And so the policy is for moratorium on that which is developed. And that's 3 provinces, right? That's Ontario and Quebec in the main, and there's one functioning reactor in New Brunswick. So that's the policy for a moratorium, and then the phase out of those ones that do exist. And I'll just say, you know, there's lots of science around nuclear energy. There are lots of developments, and there's lots of discussion around this. That's true. But you know, it's there's also a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of assumptions about how safe nuclear energy is. And I'll say, I think I'm probably the only person in the Communist Party who actually has experience, living person, current member, who has experience working in a nuclear power plant. I worked for 2 years in a nuclear generating station. So I've seen some of the weirdness on that angle of it. And, you know, maybe that's why I'm a weird person. But I think we do need a scientific approach to that. But I think that it's also, yes, the immediate issue is carbon. That is the immediate issue. But that doesn't mean that nuclear energy, we should all stampede towards it as if it's some sort of solution, as if the issues of that incredible amount and incredibly dangerous waste that is produced somehow is not a question anymore because we have to deal with the climate crisis. That's unscientific too. So we have to be careful of that. And I think we do have to confront this push to nuclear energy or at least do some research so that we can have a critical answer. But I think the party's position on that is solid. Question about the Green Party. Hey, I can't speculate on the Green Party and political alliances with them, but I will say that, you know, if any party, the Greens, the NDPs, well, not any party, but I mean, if the Greens or the NDPs or others, if they had a progressive positions on the environment with which we could work in mass organizations, bring it on. You know, that's what we need. We need a mass movement to push for progressive action on climate change, progressive action on environmental cleanup and defense. And if the Green Party can, shift away from these market-based solutions that they've been advocating consistently, maybe there's a better basis for working with them. But I can't speculate on things like a political alliance. In terms of so then there's this last question, which maybe when I'll kind of combine 2 of them. There was a question about Indigenous stewardship and state ownership. And then there was a question about what socialist solutions to energy production. I think these kind of come together in a certain way. So, I mean, the latter, socialism, I mean, that's rooted and that's based on working class power. And so a big part of a socialist solution to energy production is going to be rooted in what? Real public ownership, real democratic control, taking profit absolutely out of the mix because the capitalist class is not in power anymore. Those Indigenous stewardship and state ownership, that's a good question. And it's a complex one that I think gets resolved partially, well, not partially, but in large part in the context of the national question and also questions of decolonization, which both Kimball and Adrian kind of referenced in their presentations, but also go into in their articles. And that's not easy. And I don't think I don't think it would be useful for me to speculate in a prescriptive way on what that looks like. But I can tell you what it's not going to look like or what it shouldn't look like. It shouldn't be Canada being the world's 7th largest coal exporter and having a prime minister who has the audacity and the nerve to go to Glasgow and make, speak in platitudes about solving the climate crisis, all the while being the 7th largest exporter of coal. It's absurd. Great, we can cheer about getting rid of coal power in Ontario and eventually getting rid of it in other areas of the country. But my God, if we're the 7th biggest exporter and so much of the economy is based on that, and so much, the fact is, well, that's a big part of the problem. And that's part of the problem with capitalist solutions to the climate crisis and to the carbon issue, is that you're just trading things around on this chessboard of profit. And as long as the bad stuff is outside the borders of your country, somehow that's okay. I think we could speculate that working class and Indigenous stewardship of energy resources would confront that very problem. They would have to, or else they're not solutions. So I realize I grabbed a whole bunch of things and gave really quick answers, but I'm going to stop there.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Jean.
Yeah, just to talk about the issue of drawing women into the struggle. Well, first of all, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that regardless of our relationship to it, women are in struggle. When we saw healthcare workers protesting during this pandemic, we were watching women in struggle. I mean, you see it around the issue of paid sick days, there's so many issues that women cannot help but be not just concerned about, but mobilized by, whether it's their unequal wages. There was a very interesting, strange little supplement in the Globe and Mail recently that was trying to show people why they should get a higher education, because it showed the differential wages for people according to high school, BA, and higher degrees. But strangely enough, in addition to saying those, it also showed the difference between men and women at exactly the same level of education. And it was astounding. I'm sorry, I did cut it out, but I didn't bring it today because who knew? Didn't know I was going to talk about this. So there they are, women with BAs to men BAs, women with high school to men high school, women with higher degrees to men high degrees. And they're like making huge differences, huge. We're not talking $5 or $12. In the course of a 5-year period, it might be like $100,000. You're sitting there thinking, hello, the Globe and Mail is saying every day that we've got to solve these problems. What's going on? How is it that this is not being addressed? So there are huge issues confronting women, and women are concerned about those. We do not have to find the way to draw them in. What we have to do is find the way to transform their concerns into an understanding that the only real solution to their concerns is to change the social system. I read the Globe and Mail. I don't know why. No, I can tell you why, but I won't tell you why. But I read the Globe and Mail. And, they're always talking about women. They have huge numbers of symposium on women about how to get women up there. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know, they break the glass ceiling. Somebody is down below vacuuming up the broken glass. And nobody is talking about them. You know, the Globe and Mail is talking about breaking the glass ceiling. We've got to talk about the women who have to vacuum up the broken glass. And those women know that their solution is not breaking the glass ceiling. They're not even close to the ceiling. They're not even close to the top. Those are the women. We have to find a way to explicate the fact that capitalism may solve the problem for certain women, but for women who work, their solution is the solution of socialism. And that, so we've got to find a couple of ways to do that. One is to be on the lines with them. Another is perhaps, and I don't know, but I've put for this idea, maybe it's time for progressive Marxist women to begin to organize a women's movement that says there is another solution. There is another solution to your problems. No one else is doing it. There's bourgeois feminism. There's all sorts of feminism. We've got to start talking about communist feminism. And we've got an answer. And time we put it forward, time we started winning that struggle. That's it.
Thank you, Jean. Well, comrades, any other comments or closing remarks? I will say there was a question that, well, yeah, first, anybody want to make a comment, and then I can say anything. No? Okay. Well, comrades, there was a question about gun control that came up right after the last, when I said everything else. I think we're starting to lose a few people. I think you should check out, comrades are interested, check out the last time the party wrote extensively on that, I think was around the mass shooting in Nova Scotia. If you Googled that on the party website, and you can always email the main party account if you're interested in a particular issue. You know, the main purpose of this symposium was to dig into the history, and this was one of the projects of the Centenary Commission of the party and Spark magazine. Also, other projects were the event in May and the coverage in People's Voice around the history of the party, and the next one's going to be the film in December. So this is an part of the ongoing celebrations of the Centenary of the Communist Party of Canada. So if you haven't checked out some of the other components, also there was a historical booklet published early in the year. If you haven't seen that, please contact us to tell you how to get one of those. It's a very good piece of literature. But anyways, all this is to say that we've worked hard to try and talk a lot about the Communist Party of Canada's history over the last year. And I think there's been lots of great resources developed that we can use, continue to use. And with such big growth in the Communist Party of Canada and the crises of capitalism that we're facing, which is causing the growth in the party, that lots of people are interested in this history that's not taught in schools. Maybe one day it'll be taught in schools, but it's not taught right now. So please help build Spark magazine, help to read this stuff and spread it around. It's very much appreciated. Okay, comrades, should we call it a night? And we'll see you in December for the film release. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Drew.